Thank you very much, Karen. Thank you to the West Windsor Arts Center for inviting me to speak here today about subjects that I'm really interested in. The title of my talk is Abstraction in Mind. And let me give a brief overview of where we're going to be going today. First, I'm going to talk about what is abstraction and how can an abstract painting have meaning. I'll bring a little bit of my interest in philosophy and science into how I go about making paintings. And then I will be talking a little bit about Turing patterns, or how patterns form in nature, is one type of pattern. And I'll give a video demonstration of how I go about making a painting. So what is abstraction, and where does it fit in today's art world? I'm going to be using a framework by the art critic and painter Richard Kalina, who wrote an article in the Brooklyn Rail called The Four Corners of Painting, just to sort of scope out the entire world of painting today. It's not a perfect model, and he admits there's some blurry edges, but I found it really pretty helpful to get a sense of where the different kinds of paintings fit in today's art world. He described this as being in a post-ism era. So we have, we're past conceptualism, minimalism, impressionism, all those things, and really all corners of the painting world are active today. So for a brief tour of those four corners, if we start with what Kalina calls the mimetic, which is a focus on representation, exactly what we see. Here you see a couple of familiar names: Mel Leipzig, what just about everybody here knows, and David Casson, two of my favorite contemporary artists who work in the mimetic or representational style, where the essence is trying to capture what you see on canvas. Moving more towards abstraction, we have the style that he calls stylized mimetic, where there's still an emphasis on representation, and references to the real world are still crucial, but the artist has chosen to take a more stylized approach to the painting. Here we have Matisse, green stripe on the left, and one of my other favorite painters, Oscar Blumer, who was a German-American modernist painter in the early 1900s, who made these vivid, beautiful, abstracted landscapes, but he felt importantly for his work that it was essential to retain a link to representation. Moving more towards the abstract style, we have what's called abstract mimetic hybrid, and Cubism is a good example of this, where we have now abstraction and representation on sort of equal footing. There's still definitely links to representation in the painting, but overall the entire piece begins to look more and more abstract. And then finally, here's what Kalina calls fully abstract, and even in a painting like Pollock, where there might be just the slightest hints of something to representation, we really think of this as being a fully abstract piece of art. Now, Kalina goes on to divide the fully abstract region into four more regions. There's the gestural. This is an example by Larry Poons, where the essence, or the important part, is the sort of swooshes and swoops of color and pushing painting around on the canvas. We have a sense of the artist's gesture. Now, Poons has worked in a number of different styles, and even though this painting is called Sweet Mountain Cat, and so there's probably some kind of a reference to reality in there, and some of his paintings look very much like landscapes, we think of this, we look at it, and it feels like it's a pretty abstract piece of art. There's field or atmospheric painting, field or atmospheric abstraction, where the focus is on large fields of color, hazes of color. Rothko is a prime example of that. Robert Ryman would be another example of his white paintings. In geometric abstraction, such as this Frank Stella, the focus is using circles and cubes and other geometric shapes as the primary compositional element of the painting. And then finally, the quadrant that I found really interesting, what really caught my eye, was giving a name to what I thought my artwork was about, and that's organized organic abstraction. Here's an example by Barbara Takanaga, an artist whose work I admire at the DC Moore Gallery, and even though it's called Last Blue Wheel, it's really a pretty abstract painting. And in this style, you see she's used spheres that are very organic kind of shape, but it's clearly very organized, well thought out, planned, grammatical almost kind of painting. Kalina writes that in contemporary painting, organized organic abstraction presents itself as a form of abstraction characterized by a more distanced and grammatical approach, often borrowing elements from both geometric and gestural abstractions. I'll talk a little bit about the grammatical approach later on, but in this painting of mine, called the affect effect, which is about how your mood affects how you see the world. You see that there are thousands of hand-painted brush strokes of color, so it's very organic, but it's also very well planned out ahead of time. So that's one of the reasons I like this article. I said organized organic abstraction is a good way to label where I think most of my work fits in anyway. So what is abstraction? Of course, it's a useful shorthand that we use in the art world for saying non-representational or non-objective art, but it actually means more than that. It comes from the Latin abstrahere or abstractus, to draw away, to draw from. And one example of this is Pete Mondrian, before he started with his geometric style that we're all very familiar with. He did a series of paintings of trees over the years, where the first painting is a fairly representational piece, a little bit stylized, but over the course of a couple of years, he moved further and further away from the representational painting to something that's almost a completely abstract representation. So this is a good example of drawing away from reality. But abstraction can also mean other types of things. So think of something as being abstract if it exists in thought or in ideas rather than in objects. And in computer science, which is sort of my previous background, a large part of what you do, in fact, is coming up with the right abstractions for the system that you're going to build. And to the extent that you actually do a good job of coming up with the right abstractions, you're more likely to have a better piece of software at the end. Grady Booch, who wrote one of the seminal books on computer software design, writes that abstraction denotes the essential characteristics of an object that distinguish it from all other kinds of objects, and thus provide crisply defined conceptual boundaries relative to the perspective of the viewer. So the key part there, part of it is perspective of the viewer. So for instance, based on the perspective of the viewer, you might look at a cat differently. If you're first on the left, you see purr. If you're on the right, you see a veterinary surgeon, you see something else. So I think what Grady was doing here 20 years ago was anticipating the most important internet abstraction, which is cats. So how do we create art about ideas, or which abstracts from the real world without representation, but which still has meaning? There are a lot of different ways to do this. I'm going to touch upon some of these. There's certainly more even than this. How the artist makes the work, the process, the subject matter that's chosen, a number of different formal qualities that go into the painting. The titles are an important way of getting meaning into an abstract work. You can still have references to the physical world. The context in which a painting is exhibited is another way of getting meaning. So a black painting painted now has a different meaning than it would have when Malevich did it more than 100 years ago. Viewers bring associations, their own associations to a painting, and then metaphor. And that's actually how a lot of these other techniques that I've talked about sort of get their traction in terms of getting meaning into a painting. Now, when we're working with abstract art, not so often do we use things like narrative or allegory just because it doesn't really usually fit into the work of art. I mentioned metaphor, and it's not just a literary device to which we describe one thing in terms of another, but James Geary, who wrote a book all about metaphor, says that metaphorical thinking are instinct not just for describing, but for comprehending one thing in terms of another, for equating I with an other, shapes our view of the world, and is essential to how we communicate, learn, discover, and invent. And I believe it's crucial to the way we get meaning into art. I first became interested in metaphor about 2004, 2005 or so, when I was taking a class at the New School in New York called Philosophy in the Flesh, the Embodied Mind and its Challenge to Western Thought by Lakoff and Johnson. There's basically three tenets to this book. That the mind is inherently embodied, we perceive things the way they are because of our physical embodiment. So because of the particular nature of the pigment in our eyes and the way that it's wired up in our brain, we see the world in this sensuous three-dimensional way that we do, specifically because of that embodiment. And they believe that even things like the way reason works is based on our particular embodiment. So the neuroscientist Antonio Damasio, for instance, has shown that our emotions play an important part in reason, and our emotions are certainly an embodied part of us as human beings. People who have damage in the brain where they are no longer able to feel emotions, it turns out, are no longer able to reason very well either. The second key point of their book, which is a massive book, a very interesting one, is that thought is mostly unconscious. Things like memory retrieval, image formation, the sentences that we're actually going to form, most of that occurs below the level of awareness. So this is not, Freudian kind of repressed unconscious. This is just below the level of our awareness. A lot of what we're thinking about occurs this way. And then the final key theme of their book is that abstract concepts are largely metaphorical. So the kinds of things that we talk and think about all day long, time, events, causation, morality, they believe we reason about those things in a metaphorical way. So they go through dozens and dozens of different kinds of metaphors that we are completely ingrained into us from when we're born as we grow up. They get neurologically really wired into our brains. Things like affection is warm, important is big, happy is up, bad is stinky, categories are containers, time is motion, knowing is seeing, understanding is grasping. And if you see these metaphors here, this is the kind of the way they describe them. The domain on the left is a sort of a complex feeling, and we often reason about those things in terms of sensory motor concepts on the right, or our senses. Warm, seeing, grasping, motion, things like that. So I decided I wanted to make some paintings that brought some of this thinking into my work. One of them is called Embodied, which is my largest painting. It's 4 feet by 4 feet. And it has multiple different scales of things going on in the painting. So there's the small, tiny little marks, there's sort of some intermediate marks, and then there's these large, swooping curves that are on the scale of the human body. It's a little hard to see here, but there's kind of an orange figure-ish kind of shape in the middle that almost has a grasping of the blue sphere in the top right corner of the painting. So there's a sense of trying to get a hold of knowledge that way, using the metaphor grasping as knowledge. Another painting, Journey, uses the Lakoff and Johnson metaphor. A purposeful life is a journey. So in this painting, I have a Turing pattern, and I'll explain what those are in a little bit, that goes off, sort of looks like it recedes into distance. And the metaphor is that a person living a life is a traveler, life goals are destinations, and a life plan is an itinerary. So from that set of metaphors that we all are used to, we can reason that our path through life usually isn't straight, occasionally leaps are required, and life is precarious. My painting, In Light of Our Knowledge, which is out in the front hallway there, uses the metaphors, a couple of different metaphors for knowing. So we think of knowing as seeing, I see what you mean. Attempting to gain knowledge is searching. An aid to knowing is a light source. We try to shine a little light on a subject. So a bit about perception. A lot of people see this painting and they just see there's a lot of curves and swoops of color. Others immediately see that there's a figurative element to the painting. And if you haven't seen it, once you see the figurative element, or maybe more than one figurative element, it's kind of impossible not to see. And that shows how what we know about the world helps affect and shape what it is that we actually see in the world. I usually think to quote, but writes that art does not exist only to entertain, but also to challenge one to think, to provoke, even to disturb, in a constant search for the truth. And that brings us to the topic of subject matter. So whereas some artists like to focus on landscapes, or still lives, or portraits, the subject matter that interests me the most are ones related to philosophy, cognitive science, physics, and math. And so I bring a lot of those interests into my artwork. I read a lot of books on these subjects, and when I find a topic that I think is interesting, I'll write down a potential painting title, and then at some point later we'll try and figure out how can I make a painting that somehow is inspired by that subject. One of the things philosophers and linguists often talk about is something called intentionality, which is how is it that a painting, or really a sentence or a thought in your mind, which is maybe marks on the paper or something going on in your head, can be about something in the world. And this aboutness is called intentionality. Often in a lot of the philosophical texts, they'll talk about what it's like to have a sentence be about a rose. And so this painting, I just thought I would take a rose I got from my wife and use the outline as the compositional element in this painting. So it's, in a sense, about how painting can be about something. I'm very interested in the study of consciousness, and one of the topics that comes up over and over and over again is something called the hard problem of consciousness. And it is, we know a lot about how the mind works and how the brain works, especially at the lower levels, but we don't really have a good understanding of how it is that the mind can put together this incredibly rich experience that we have of the world. And that gap between what we know about the low level and the level of consciousness is called the explanatory gap. So in this painting, I have two levels of Turing patterns, and one of them is sort of an abstraction of a drawing, the self-portrait that I did, which itself is a sort of abstraction from a photograph that I had taken. So that was the way I tried to capture this notion of the difficulty of mapping between layers of explanation. So there's this attempt to understand how it is we have this rich sensory experience. And qualia are the term that philosophers are always debating whether they exist, and even if they exist, do we need to try and figure out an explanation for them? It's what is it like to see red? What is it like to feel warmth? It's that experiential character of all of our perceptions. And some people think that qualia are just along for the ride. They're just states of the brain that don't really need to be explained at all. Others think, are you kidding me? John Searle, famous philosopher, says, well, I'll get to that on the next slide. Are you kidding me? We have to explain how qualia work. It's the most important part of our existence, is how is it that we feel the way we do. So I wanted to have a painting about qualia. Seeing red, especially, and feeling warmth, perhaps. Our eyes take in two separate images, slightly offset from each other, and they're a fairly low-resolution image in our brain, but somehow the brain puts it together, and we get an incredibly detailed, what feels like high-resolution model of the world that we live in. This is sometimes called the reality problem. How is it our mind binds all of our senses together into this experience of the world? In this painting, called The Reality Problem, I used what's called the impossible triangle, also Penrose tribar, after physicist Roger Penrose, where I took this kind of impossible triangle that you've probably seen before and turned it into a tessellation, which is a repeating pattern that fills the entire plane. And if you kind of like play your eye over it, it might look like it's three-dimensional, or it looks like it's a scaffolding or a construction that it might fit, but then if you kind of follow it through, you realize it's not really possible. So that's how I tried to approach the reality problem. And then philosophers are wondering whether our consciousness or qualia can be causal, or are they just along for the ride? So John Searle, I was going to say before, the philosopher says, of course our consciousness is causal. I think I want my arm to raise, and the darn thing goes up. But others will say, no. Consciousness is epiphenomenal, which means it's sort of just along for the ride, kind of like the foam on a wave coming into shore, thinking that it's in charge of driving the wave home. Well, really the foam is just an epiphenomenon of the wave. It's just kind of an effect. I started to really get interested in the topic of consciousness in 1995 or so. I was in San Francisco on a business trip at Borders, of all places, in San Francisco, and I stumbled across this book by Daniel Dennett. Fascinating book. I'd been interested in the mind earlier. My background in software engineering led me into artificial intelligence a little bit and computational theories of mind. But this was such a fascinating book. Even as I read it, though, I was getting angry and I didn't always agree with the philosopher, but it got me thinking about a lot of different things, and two ideas in particular: his multiple drafts theory of consciousness and his center of narrative gravity theory of the self have made it into a number of my paintings. In multiple drafts, Dennett suggests that at any given time, we've got a lot of different things going on in our head, and only some of them kind of get written down in the permanent tracks of our memory. And those are the things that are what we think of as us having been aware of. And there's all kinds of interesting psychology tests that they do on undergrads and whoever that show that this actually might be a reasonable theory. So what I have here are 3 different levels of Turing patterns. This red you can see, and then so if you see this piece here, you can see it again here at a different level, and then here again at a different level. It's a little hard to make out. But I have multiple different levels of patterning going on to represent multiple drafts theory. Now, if you perhaps remember from your physics classes, there's a concept called center of gravity. You think, well, that's a pretty useful concept. The center of gravity of a vase, if I put it on the table, if the center of gravity is over the table, the vase will stand up. As soon as the center of gravity reaches the edge of the table, the vase will fall over. But the center of gravity is not anything real. It's just an abstraction. It's a useful abstraction. It helps us make predictions about the world, but it's not a real thing. Now, Dan Dennett thinks that the self is something like that abstraction. He calls it the center of narrative gravity, and that over time we tell and spin stories about ourselves, about our history, about our past, and that what our self is this sort of useful abstraction for who we are. And so I thought that was a really interesting idea and created a series of nearly 30 paintings based on it. This is number 24, where I have intersecting swirls of gradients of color that create this sense of depth, but perhaps with a nebulous core that changes depending on how you look at it and how far away you're standing from it. So that's how I approached center of narrative gravity. Douglas Hofstadter is a cognitive scientist who wrote this book, Gödel, Escher, Bach. He's probably launched thousands of cognitive science careers. It's a fascinating, amazing book. And it's one of his key points in the book is the idea of a strange loop, and that consciousness is a recursive, self-referential structure and set of processes in the brain where the highest levels of abstraction sort of reach back down, refer to the lower levels, and the lower levels kind of swirl their way back up to the top levels, and you have this sort of bootstrapping process that gives you a sense of consciousness. Now, he uses as a model, or just an analogy, really, way of thinking about it, if you take a video camera and you point it at a TV who has the output from the video camera on the TV, you can get these really amazing self-referential feedback kind of patterns that occur. I encourage you to try this at home. It's quite mesmerizing and fun. And what happens is, after a while, you get these things that exist that aren't really in the world, right? These are not things that I was taking a picture of. This is, what occurs when you have this type of self-referential system. And you can envision this being like trying to get your head around some thoughts. Things are swirling around, things are arising and disappearing, maybe getting a little bit turbulent at times. At this point I have the structure. It doesn't look like a TV, doesn't look like anything. It's just the colors and the shapes swirling back and forth in a kind of feedback loop. So I decided I wanted to make a number of paintings based on the idea of strange loops, and Because Hofstadter called the book Gödel Escher Bach, I decided to tap into some Escher and started with the tessellation, which again is a repeating pattern that fills a plane. And then I looped that around using tools like Photoshop, and then had multiple levels of abstraction here. And you can see it's a little hard, again, on a screen projection, to see the different kinds of interactions of shapes that occur. This is one of the Strange Loops paintings. Strange Loops number 4, which is on the back wall here, is another one. This has 3 different sets of tessellations and patterns going on that are looped around. And depending on how you see it, you'll get a completely different effect. If you look straight on, you'll usually see something like this. It's lit. You don't have the light on right now. Like we also have, there's metallic paint in the painting. So if you catch it at a different angle, you'll see a totally different set of abstractions. And if you catch it even at a different level, there's some interference paint going on, and there's a magenta cast that will come through that just barely shows up at the bottom of the photograph here. Alfred North Whitehead said or wrote that art is the imposing of a pattern on experience, and our aesthetic enjoyment is recognition of the pattern. He then went on to say that he hates it when people take his work out of context because it sometimes changes the meaning, but I hope I didn't do that here, and I think it's good for this talk. That brings me to the point of Turing patterns, and one of the ways that patterns might form in nature. He spent a few years in Princeton where he got his PhD. During World War II, he helped to break the German Enigma cipher and was recognized for that tremendous achievement by the British government. He is one of the fathers of computer science and artificial intelligence. He's known for his theory of computability, how it is that a simple abstract machine could compute anything that's computable. We call that his Turing machine. And he's also known for the Turing test in artificial intelligence, the theory that if you have a computer that's smart enough to fool somebody else through a particular kind of interaction, that you're talking to a person rather than a computer, then the Turing test says that computer has reached a certain level of intelligence. A little more to it than that, but that's kind of the summary. And later in his life, in 1952, just a couple years before he died, he wrote what turned out to be an incredibly influential paper in a completely different subject. It's called The Chemical Basis of Morphogenesis. And he proposed that there are reaction diffusion systems that would occur in nature, especially in, for instance, the cells of a forming embryo. And what that means is you have several different signals going on in the cells. That one acts as, they spread through diffusion, and one acts as an activator and the other an inhibitor. You don't really need to know the details of that. They basically interact and sort of balance each other out. And if the rates of change of those signals are different, you end up getting really interesting patterns that might be the cause of patterns like this that occur in zebras or on leopards and other areas of nature. Now, this photograph, by the way, is from an old friend of mine who is now the curator of education at the Reed Park Zoo in Tucson. And beautiful picture of these pattern formations that occur. And you can see little interactions between the stripes. This is a giant pufferfish, showing also Turing-type patterns. And for a while it was debated whether there was actually a Turing process, a reaction diffusion process that caused these patterns. And I guess it still is a little bit, but recently there's been more evidence. Scientists have found what they think are the markers of the activator and inhibitor in some of the embryos of certain kinds of zebrafish and other fish that they think get frozen in place at a certain point in time of the development of the animal and then lead to this type of pigmentation. It turns out that if you were to look at parts of the brain of a monkey, and I think also in humans as well, there's something called an ocular dominance map. So in the brain, some of our cells respond to the right side visual field, and some of them respond more to left side visual field, or left eye. And if you were to map that out at a certain part of the, I think it's the visual cortex, you would get this type of pattern. And Hubel and Weasel, who wrote this paper, suggested that it might be a Turing-type pattern that's responsible for this. So I thought these patterns were really interesting. I started making paintings before I knew they were Turing patterns, where I was doing kind of looping drawings. I liked it because of the positive-negative shape interaction. It gave me a real framework to hang my color on. And I started to come up with ways that I could simulate this or create these patterns on the computer. I eventually learned that what I was doing was simulating a process that Turing had come up with in the 50s. And then I've since developed a number of different techniques for using this to help me design some of my paintings, using Photoshop and a couple different programming languages that I'm familiar with from my previous life. So what you do is you start with an image where each pixel in the image represents the concentration of an activator versus an inhibitor. And then you iterate through this reaction diffusion process over and over again until you reach an equilibrium. And you can start, for instance, with random noise. And this is kind of like what would happen in a cell, most likely. You might have a random concentration of chemicals in a cell, and then you activate and inhibit over and over again until you get equilibrium. So here's an example of that. This is random noise, and I run the Turing reaction diffusion simulation over and over again until I get a steady state equilibrium. And what you can do, as an artist, you can then take liberty to add some swirls and curves and waves and other zigzags if I want to try and add meaning to the painting in a different way than just a random starting point. Another way you can do this is you can start with an image instead of a random noise. And that's another way. If you kind of get the parameters right, you can keep some level of the image in the final painting. So that explanatory gap painting I showed you earlier had a little bit of my portrait still in it that you could see. And so, for instance, if we take the West Windsor Arts Center, and we start with an image there, and we do it on a little bit different granularity. We can abstract it away. And you can still get a sense that the original picture is there. So I use both strategies. Here's the painting after the dance, which is on the wall over there. I started with Matisse's famous The Dance, and I did the abstraction process on that, and then used similar colors to the ones Matisse painted. In a different style, I wanted to make it my own. I have some of the depth, three-dimensionality that I'm interested in the painting, and here you can see them both next to each other. But on the screen, you can't quite get the colors right, but you can see the real painting there. Of interest is that Benedict Cumberbatch, who you may know of as Sherlock, is tagged to play Alan Turing in a feature film set to come out this November, so that should be really interesting. Here's one of my Turing pattern paintings where you have different gradients of color going opposite directions to create a sort of shimmering, I don't know if it shimmers on the screen so much, but a shimmering spark of creation. In the painting, Seeing It Through is another Turing pattern where you can see I did a number of distortions to the Turing pattern to change the scale of different parts of the painting. I was reading the philosopher Thomas Metzinger, who suggests that consciousness is like a window we see through, but it's hard to experience the consciousness. We don't have access to the construction process in the brain, only the final result. So for this piece, I have some metallic paints and this sort of Vasarely almost type distortion that sort of like a tunnel effect of how we see through our processes to see the world. You don't have to take the Turing process all the way through to completion. You can stop it. And that's how I came up with this design for approaching equilibrium, because I like the way this particular composition worked. A couple months ago, I was at Princeton University, and Gary Marcus, the author of Guitar Zero and the upcoming book, The Birth of the Mind, he gave this talk, and he displayed this slide, which he was kind enough to share with me, of a field programmable gate array as being part of his theory for how the mind might work. This is a type of computer chip that's not hard-coded at the factory, but rather it is programmable in the field. So for instance, he, I think, is thinking of it as being, the brain has got some things that are hard-coded when we're born, but a lot of it can be wired up based on experience later on. That's one of his theories of the mind. And I thought it was an interesting question because of my experience from computers in the past, but also because it reminded me of my painting idea formation from last year, where this is also a Turing pattern, but I started with a very different kind of starting point. And I was thinking of how ideas kind of build up and crowd each other and eventually form into larger ideas. That was sort of the gist behind my painting. So another way artists can introduce meaning, or at least things to look at, are through formal qualities. And I mentioned earlier, Richard Kleeman talks about the grammar of organized organic abstraction. And I think of the grammar or the vocabulary of an artist are the knobs that the artist chooses to twiddle in making his or her body of work. So for instance, with Chuck Close, we think of the knobs as being grids, or at least in his most iconic sort of portraits, as being these grids, these organic little abstractions that he paints within each cell of the grid. He uses optical color mixing in a very intuitive way for him, and he works from photographic portrait. Some of the knobs that I work with are color theory, and I'll go through a couple of these. Gradients of color. I've spoken about Turing patterns, these maze-like marks, various scales, and tessellations. So this first term, chromostereopsis, it's really an atrocious kind of term. It's a visual illusion where colors convey a sense of depth. But since it's an atrocious term, with apologies to Mary Poppins, we have supercalifragilistic chromostereopsis, where various different colors appear to have a different level of depth. So there are a lot of theories as to why this happens. One of them is something called chromatic aberration. And related to that is how different color eyes, different color light waves focus on your retina differently, and your brain can interpret that as depth. Different colors, because they're different parts of the spectrum, bend differently as they enter your eye, so they end up on different parts of your retina, and your brain then determines to, or puts that together as meaning that those colors are originating from a different point in space. Some people think that luminance, which is the amount of light coming from a painting or an object, also plays a part, as is chroma, which is the colorfulness of a color at a given luminance level, sort of how much color there is from a neutral gray at the same brightness. But those also play a role in how your brain perceives depth purely from the light that's entering the eye. In this painting, realization, which it's a little bit hard to see on the screen, you can see the same kind of effect occurring here. You get a strong sense of depth from the kinds of color interactions that are going on, this type of chromostereopsis. Just to see one of my paintings up close, the detail, you can see these marks of color. What looks like transparency at some point is really different yellows here. This is a different yellow than this, and this is a different red marking than this. But if you mix it just right, you can get a sense of overlapping and transparency in the final painting. Another knob that I use is gradients, where a color changes as it moves along the painting. So for instance, yellow goes from a bright yellow to a darker yellow as it moves along this way, and then to green as it gets here, and there's a blue gradient that moves this way. And because the eye reads gradients as being perhaps light falling off, the brain sort of puts that together as a sense of depth. And so in some cases you can read that as depth in the painting. You can also read it metaphorically as light changing or moving around the painting. Scale is important to my work. The actual painting here is only 12 by 12 inches, and depending on how close you stand, you might see something very different. So if you stand up close, you can see the individual marks. If you move back a little bit farther, you start to get some optical mixing of the colors, and if you stand, further back, at least I get a very strong sense of depth as the different gradients of color and the different colors interact in a certain way in your eye. With tessellations, there's the repeating of a pattern to fill the plane. So I've taken a particular tessellation, repeated it, did a little bit of artistic license in the middle to rotate some of the tiles to get this the middle. The metaphor here is our ideas are held in place by a framework of concepts, so it's kind of literal, really. For this painting, I actually have photographs of the work in progress. So starting with the dreaded blank white canvas, I fixed that real quick by toning the underpainting. I cut the shapes that I'm going to use in tessellation and then trace them out onto the canvas. Here you can see using a water-soluble pencil the pattern I'm going to use. Because this is a hard edge painting, copious amounts of masking tape is used until I finish the underpainting. I then begin to make my little marks on the canvas until the painting is complete. I use a number of concepts from Gestalt psychology, which has been around for more than 100 years, but especially in the 50s and 60s, authors like Rudolf Arnheim documented it extensively, and it's basically how the mind pulls together from ambiguous data a sense of reality. So, for instance, how here we see a couple of different rounded triangles, but we read it as a spiked sphere, or here we have 3 Pac-Men and 3 V's, and yet it's almost impossible not to read it as a couple of triangles, one including the other. So that type of thing happens in a lot of my work, in the painting Any Which Way. This painting has arrows, squares, triangles, stars, hexagons, and I encourage the viewer to sort of look around and let the eye shift and focus on different parts and pull them together in the way he or she sees. This is a good time to talk about, really briefly, or to do an illusion about how our brain is really pulling together things maybe that aren't there. So I'm going to ask you all to try and fixate, if you can, right on this dot, and keep your eye there. Now what's going to happen, if you fixate right on the dot, you've all probably heard of after images, where if you look at a red screen for a while, and then you look away, you get a green turquoise kind of after image. We think, oh yeah, it's the eyes getting tired, and that's why I get an after image. But there's something more going on. If it works for you, you'll see that as the shape outline changes, your after image suddenly changes. How can that be, right? So if you focus on the middle, the first shape you get on the left will be, you'll see an orange shape, and then suddenly as the shape changes, you get a green shape, or vice versa. So again, it's a little hard on the screen, but the brain is doing something really mysterious there in putting together an after image that's changing after the fact based on what outline is there. It's not just what part of your cells in your eyes are fatigued from looking at a too bright a color. Titles are important in the meaning of a painting, and Bob Nickus, in his book, Painting Abstraction, says that any full reading of an abstract painting must include the reading and negotiation of the title, if there is one. Titles, as we know, are not merely the names of things. Titles go directly to intention. This is real intention, not intentionality. So in this painting, one of my favorite titles, I had woken one morning feeling like I was just working furiously on solving some kind of problem, and I couldn't quite get my head around it, and I had this swirling kind of image of things going on in my brain. And I ran downstairs, and I grabbed a lump of clay, rolled it out, twisted it around, trying to capture what was in my head. Used that then as a source of drawing for the composition on this painting, called Awakening from a Dream of a Problem Not Yet Solved. I was also reading a book about aesthetics where the author was contemplating what it means to be a work of art for a piece of music. What is the actual object, the art object itself? Is it the sheet music that the original composer wrote? Is it a performance of the piece with the composer? Any later performance of the piece? Just the idea of it? Is it the recording or any recording? So painting is called The Ontological Status of the Moonlight Sonata. And for this painting, I have divided the canvas up into 3 different sections, which are proportionally spaced according to the length of the musical piece, which is, this is its real name. Beethoven, I don't think knew it, it's not at all. And these red marks are cribbed from sheet music, and there's a little bit of a Gestalt thing going on here, trying to figure out what the object is for a work of art. And I'd like to show you a demonstration, video demonstration. If you're interested in the longer version of this, you can visit my website. This is a sped up version of what's already a sped up video, but you'll see I start with an underpainting. I have a Turing pattern that I transferred. I've worked on the underpainting some more, and then I begin to make the thousands and thousands of these hand-painted little marks. I'm using here a curtain rod, which is a fantastic maul stick to help me keep my hand steady. It hooks real nicely on the top of the easel, and I'm just dipping my very small number 0, 00 brush into my mixed gradient of color on the palette, and then it's a process of working meditatively, mindfully, hopefully focusing on my breath, occasionally focusing on a Mets game or something like that in the background, and working until the painting is completed. There's always a point about halfway through one of my paintings where I start to freak out because it doesn't look right and I'm not sure it's going to come together, but I've since learned to work through that, and then I just know that when you have half a painting of marks and half a painting of not, it's not going to look right. So I keep working through it until the piece is completed. In real life, I have no patience at all. So I chose this particular style of painting really to force me to slow down and be in the moment of making the painting. The artist's hand is on every single square inch of the work, as you can see. The Newark-born abstract expressionist Grace Hardin said, "I cannot expect even my own art to provide all the answers, only to hope it keeps asking the right questions." So I don't think I've pulled together all the answers, but hopefully I've given you a lot of questions, a lot of things to think about. This painting pulls it all together in a certain way with tessellations and dimension and depth and marks and Gestalt. So with that, let me thank you very much for coming. I'd be happy to take some questions. Does anybody have any questions?
Nothing I can't articulate about fractals, but this reminds me of fractals in having seen fractals.
Yep. Jane mentions fractals, and fractals are self-similarity at multiple different scales. They're a mathematical construct for the most part, and as rightly so, in a number of my paintings, they're not technically, I don't think they would technically fit the definition of a fractal, but there is self-similarity at multiple scales in a number of my paintings.
I noticed you did a few representational artworks. Do you still switch back and forth between representation and abstraction?
Yeah, every once in a while I like to change it up, do something like a landscape or a portrait, just to kind of exercise those artistic muscles. Most of what I'm interested in doing is in this style, but again, every once in a while it is fun to do something like that.
A lot of your paintings there seems to be like a light or something glowing through. Can you talk about that?
For a number of the paintings, I'm interested in that metaphor about seeing is knowing and illumination being knowledge. So I specifically go for the colors that will get that effect. I also just happen to like the way that looks on a painting like this. If it was lit a little more, you would see it. And it's just a choice of the colors, really, that when you put certain colors next to other ones, you can get that kind of shimmering, illuminated effect. This painting is actually kind of interesting. There's something called the Purkinje effect, where as the lighting illumination changes on the painting, our eyes see certain colors differently. So our eyes start to see reds go darker faster as the illumination goes down. And a painting like this, you can even see, even though it's not really that lit, it seems to me at least like the middle is illuminated. And that's partially because of that effect, that the blues are read by our eyes better at the low light than the red is, which tends to go darker faster.
You mean when the lights go on, the reds will...
Yep, you'll see more of the reds, and
it won't be the same glow.
it'll be definitely a slightly different glow, yeah?
Presumably, you're trying to say something that's not so easily verbalized, and that's why you're doing painting at all, as compared to what you were doing in your earlier incarnation. I'm wondering if you could just comment on what are you trying to say with the artwork? It's, here I'm asking you to put into words what you're making it painted, like that.
Well, yeah, there are people who do conceptual art, and that's popular in some places, but I think in terms of visual art, I want the painting to be visual. A lot of conceptual art, I think, works as a concept, so you don't even need to really see it most of the time. You can just hear about it or read about it and get the point. So that's one of the reasons I work visually, it's about trying to share my interest in visual art through a very personal style and approach. These maze-like drawings are ones that I did as a child, and when I moved from computer science into the art world, I was looking for a particularly personal approach to make the paintings. I was actually taking a course on abstraction, and I was very frustrated with trying to abstract from a vase or something like that, and then just started making these marks out of my childhood suddenly. And it felt right, it looked interesting, I thought. I was getting really interesting color interactions, and said, this is something I can work with. And then I went on to develop it. I saw a number of exhibitions in Manhattan that were based on mark making, that sort of validated my approach to making paintings that were full of marks like this. And I thought, this is the way I want to express myself in this type of art. And I just chose most of my subject matter to be about my interest in philosophy, mind, cognitive science, things like that.
I'm sure that I saw your work the first time at the Spine and Brain Care Center in Alexander. What if you just talk a little bit about that particular venue, there was certain inspirations there. They certainly kept some of your work in some of the conference centers and so forth. So it just seemed to be, I could use words like symbioses. You do it.
Well, it was a great honor to be invited to show at the Princeton Brain and Spine Care Institute, which is a neurosurgeon's office, but they happen to care very much about having the patients there get an experience of art when they come in, because it is potentially a traumatic time to have to visit a brain surgeon. And the particular show that I was in, Jennifer Kadoff and another artist whose name escapes me right now, all put work that was sort of had elements of repetition in it, and it was a very nice venue to be able to show my work and to know that it was soothing for the patients and that the doctors liked it as well.
Seemed brain-like.
Yeah.
Right? In the best sense.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of different ways where I try to bring that into the paintings, yep.
Andrew, I really appreciated seeing your work on the piano sonata. I thought that was really fascinating how through the visual art you could also interpret a classical music piece. And I was wondering, have there been any artists that you work with that say were performance artists and interpreted your work? So from the other side.
I've not done that. That's a very interesting idea, though. The closest I haven't had anything like that happen. The closest I had was at a show at GR Greenway. That was a really great show to be in a number of years ago. A woman came up to me and said, I've been in your painting before. I've dreamt that dream, or I've been in that painting before, and she went on to describe her dream and the experience of what it was like. I think it was that embodiment painting that I showed you earlier on, and that was just sort of a great experience to have somebody who can really resonate with what you're trying to do. That's right.
Oh, yeah, and do you find that most of your inspiration comes from reading philosophy books? Trying to be the interpreter of that? Or?
Philosophy, and also on the cognitive science side, so the sort of the difference, the philosophy of mind tends to be a little bit more of the armchair variety. People think about what they think, the way things should work, and cognitive science is a little bit more on the experimental side, and it comes at it from the computational approach to thinking. So that, and then also I didn't show them here, but I have paintings about physics, quantum physics, things like that, and a few that I think probably just touch mostly upon mathematical sorts of concepts. It's reading, for me, all those different kinds of material. I'm actually probably better at buying the books than reading them all, but as I go through them, I come up with lots of ideas for things that I want
So
to express.
something will inspire you if you're reading something on a page and
Absolutely, like there'll be a phrase, and I'll say, oh, that's an interesting title, or if I tweak it around with some wordplay or something, that's an interesting title, how can I get that idea into a painting? Now, I don't necessarily, I've explained to you all here what goes behind my thinking on a lot of these paintings. It's not crucial to me that the viewer gets all that. I'm mostly interested in making it a visual experience that the viewer will enjoy and want to look at for a long time. But it's great if the viewer also appreciates some of those subjects as well. Sure.
Well, I haven't thought about this much, and I probably shouldn't be saying this, but I will. The woman and the dream. I remember being maybe around 5 and having fevers. And being sick and having these, like intense sorts of colors and things. I don't think it was dreaming exactly, but maybe it was semi-dreaming. That's all. Not as sort of organized in a nice way that I see your works, but more chaotic, but very colorful. And I just never did anything with that. But maybe you have. Was your own?
Well, that's part of what I love reading about the study of psychology. A lot of it, there are people trying to figure out how it is the dreams work and how people can have phenomenal experiences in their dreams, or through all kinds of other experiences. How is it that a dream might differ than reality in terms of the qualia, and how that might work in the brain. Thank you all very much. I really appreciate coming out today.